Picture a city on fire, reduced to a hellscape of twisted metal and rubble. A city where life expectancy was measured not in days, but in hours. This was Stalingrad. Between August 1942 and February 1943, this city on the Volga River became the epicenter of one of history's most brutal and decisive conflicts, a battle that would forever be known as the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. Why Stalingrad? Why did this one city become the focal point of such unimaginable fury? For Adolf Hitler, it was more than just a strategic objective. Yes, Stalingrad was a major industrial center, a vital transport hub on the Volga River that connected Moscow to the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. Capturing it would cripple the Soviet war economy. But there was something more personal, more obsessive driving the German Führer. The city bore the name of his arch-nemesis, Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, conquering Stalingrad was a symbolic act of ultimate triumph over communism and the Soviet leader himself. He declared that no German soldier would ever leave the city once it was taken. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, a declaration of intent from which there would be no retreat. For the Soviets, the stakes were just as high. Stalin's Order, number 227, became the rallying cry of the defense, not one step back. Retreat was not an option. The city had to be held at any cost. For the Red Army and the civilians trapped within, abandoning Stalingrad meant abandoning the motherland itself. It was a fight for survival, for their very existence against an invader who sought to erase them from history. The city, named for their leader, became a fortress of national pride and defiance. In late August 1942, the German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable fighting forces, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. They were commanded by Friedrich Paulus, a methodical and loyal, if not particularly imaginative, general. The assault began with one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of sorties, dropping tons of explosives and incendiary bombs, turning the city into a sea of fire and smoke. The initial German plan was simple: crush the Soviet defenses quickly and seize the city. They expected it to fall within weeks. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Germans encountered was not a conventional battlefield. The bombed-out ruins of Stalingrad became the defenders' greatest asset. Every shattered building, every pile of rubble, every collapsed factory hall became a fortress. The fighting devolved into a nightmarish, close-quarters struggle the Germans called Rettenkrieg, Rat War. Battles were not fought for streets, but for individual floors of apartment buildings. For single rooms, for sewer tunnels, and for stairwells. A front line could be the space between a kitchen and a living room. Soldiers on both sides used grenades, submachine guns, bayonets, and sharpened shovels in vicious hand-to-hand combat. A single strategic point, like the Pavlov's house apartment building, could be held by a handful of Soviet soldiers for months, tying down significant German forces. The massive grain elevator, a concrete silo near the city center, became another legendary mob point. It changed hands over a dozen times in a matter of days. The grain inside mixed with the blood of countless soldiers. Snipers became kings of this urban jungle. Legendary figures like the Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, stalked the ruins, picking off German officers and soldiers, waging a psychological war as deadly as the physical one. For the German soldiers, accustomed to the sweeping blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Europe, this was a new and terrifying kind of warfare. Morale began to crumble under the constant stress, the filth, the disease, and the ever-present threat of a sniper's bullet or a sudden, brutal assault from the shadows. As autumn turned to winter, the German advance slowed to a crawl, measured in meters per day. They had taken over 90% of the city, pushing the beleaguered Soviet 62nd Army into a few narrow strips of land along the west bank of the Volga River. But those last few hundred meters were an unbreachable wall of resistance. The Volga itself became the city's lifeline, under constant German artillery and air attack. Soviet ferries and barges braved the icy waters, bringing in just enough reinforcements, ammunition, and food to keep the defense alive. For every soldier who made it across, another was lost to the shelling or the freezing river. It was a desperate, bloody supply line, but it held. While the world's attention was fixed on the brutal street fighting inside Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was planning something audacious. They had been quietly amassing huge reserves of men and tanks on the flanks of the German position, in areas held by weaker Romanian and Italian forces. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Two massive pincers smashed through the Axis flanks, north and south of the city. The German generals were caught completely by surprise. Within just 4 days, the Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, snapping the trap shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled, trapped. Field Marshal Paulus pleaded with Hitler for permission to break out. The window of opportunity was small, but it was there. Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast, promising that they would be supplied by air. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, arrogantly assured Hitler his air force could deliver the hundreds of tons of supplies needed each day. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe was battered, the weather was atrocious, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire was deadly. The promised air bridge was a catastrophic failure, delivering only a tiny fraction of what was needed. Inside the pocket, or Kessel, the situation for the German soldiers became a living nightmare. The brutal Russian winter set in, with temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees Celsius. Ammunition ran low, food disappeared. Soldiers were reduced to eating their horses, then dogs, cats, and rats. They froze to death in their foxholes, their uniforms offering little protection. Frostbite, typhus, and dysentery ran rampant. The once mighty Sixth Army was starving, freezing, and dying. A German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched in December, but it was halted by desperate Soviet resistance, miles from the pocket. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished. By January 1943, the Soviet forces began to slice the pocket into smaller pieces, tightening the noose. They offered Paulus terms of surrender. Hitler, furious, ordered him to fight to the last man, promoting him to field marshal, a subtle hint that no German field marshal had ever been taken alive. But Paulus chose survival over a pointless suicide. On January 31st, he surrendered his headquarters. The last pockets of German resistance fell on February 2nd. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Of the nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped in the Kessel, over 91,000 were taken prisoner. Starved, frostbitten, and sick, less than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The total casualties for both sides in the entire Stalingrad campaign are estimated to be close to 2 million people, making it the single bloodiest battle in human history. The city itself was utterly annihilated. The defeat at Stalingrad was more than just a military catastrophe for Nazi Germany. It was a psychological shockwave that reverberated across the world. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. The Wehrmacht had lost one of its best armies, along with vast quantities of irreplaceable tanks, artillery, and aircraft. From this point forward, the German war machine on the Eastern Front would be on the defensive, pushed back relentlessly by a resurgent Red Army, all the way to Berlin. Stalingrad was the meat grinder that consumed the strength of the Third Reich. It was the turning point where the tide of war irrevocably turned, paid for with a river of blood on the banks of the Volga. The sacrifice made in those frozen ruins guaranteed that the war would not be won by Hitler. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments. If you found this video insightful, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of the figures and moments that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.